Welcome to Friends with Fertility, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of fertility, reproductive health, and all the emotional journeys that are in between. I'm your host, Elizabeth King, a fertility expert dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, support, and inspiration you need on your path to parenthood. Whether you're just starting out, exploring your options, or looking for solidarity and advice, we are here for you. Let's embark on this journey together and turn uncertainty into empowerment and make friends with fertility. Let's get started. Hello there. Welcome back to Friends with Fertility. Today we talk with Melissa Brisman, and it's an interesting conversation. She is a reproductive lawyer. She went through the process herself in 1996 before all this was as popular as it is. What I love about that is the fact that she understands the nuances from being in the situation herself, which a lot of people can't say that they have been. So I love that about Melissa. Her law firm drafts and negotiates contracts for lots of types of reproductive arrangements, including gestational carrier contracts, ovum, sperm, embryo donation, and adoption, works with international clients, finalizes same sex and step parent adoptions, etc. The list goes on. She has such an impressive bio. We will put that in the notes of the show, but she has done some major things with being the first attorney to obtain court orders directing that the genetic parents be placed on their original birth certificates of the children born to gestational carriers in the state of Maine in 1997 and the state of New Jersey in 2000. And it goes on. She went before the Supreme Court of Massachusetts in 2001 and the Supreme Court of New York in 2004, setting legal precedents for birth orders in these states, and really is just such a great person and her team to have on your fertility team. I always talk about who's on your fertility team and who's going to be there to support you. And this conversation, we talk about a lot of different aspects of why you need an attorney, what to watch out for, and just some advice that Melissa gives. So I hope you enjoy listening and let us know if you have any questions after the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Friends with Fertility. Today we have a guest, Melissa. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And Melissa is an attorney who specializes in reproductive law. So as I read her bio before we got on, it leads me to so many questions, and I'm so excited about this because first of all, wow, you have done a lot and
Thank
congratulations.
you.
How did you get into this field? Tell us your story, your backstory, first of all, because obviously this is near to your heart. So let's start there.
Absolutely. So I've been doing this for about 25 years now, and I got into reproductive law when my twins were born from a surrogate. So that was 26 years ago. And at that time, there was really nobody else having babies from what we call gestational surrogates. I would say there was maybe 20 cases in the entire United States in a year, and now we are seeing upwards of 10,000 every year.
And what was your story about surrogacy? Had you been trying for a long time? What was
So physically, I couldn't carry the baby, and I really wanted my own biological child. So I went to different fertility clinics and said, I see that this treatment is being offered. Um, and finally, after probably about a year of going to different facilities, one doctor said, yeah, I don't see why we can't do that here. We do egg donation. So gestational surrogacy is just egg donation in reverse, right? So if you're a woman who needs an egg donor, that was gone, right? But so in my case, what would be happening is it would just be like the surrogate is carrying someone else's egg, but the intention of who's going to keep it is different, right?
right?
So I got a doctor to agree, and then when I was done, I thought it shouldn't be this hard. If this treatment is available, if it's working, it should be a lot easier.
And isn't it amazing from 26 years ago to now how much this industry has grown and the conversation and the awareness around it? I mean, I even know 15 years ago with surrogacy, you really didn't even touch it one, because it was so expensive, and two, because a lot of doctors weren't really familiar with what it entailed in its entirety. And now I feel like it really is an open conversation for many different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons that it's become more popular. The biggest, I think, is that it's become much more successful. So, over the last 25 years, IVF statistics have become much higher. So, when I was having my children, they put in what you call day one embryos, embryos that created and then basically transferred the next day. Now they grow them out 5 days, they test them, and in some cases, they have as high as an 85% success rate per embryo transfer. So when you're spending all this money, you want to know that you have a good chance, right? So, but there's all the laws have changed; they've become more updated, and the biggest increase, honestly, is same-sex male couples. I
Right.
think that's where most of that's coming from the gay movement, the marriage. When you have married people have families, but the expense is actually astronomical now. It is
I
4 to 5 times as much as it used to be.
Oh, that's interesting. So, when you did it, it wasn't as much as it is now?
It was still pricey to do the IVF. But now, what's happening now is when demand increases, right? Sometimes supply goes down. So the supply of wombs, for lack of a better word, is increased at the same rate as the number of people who want to do it.
Right.
So what has to go up in order to get more people to do it is the carrier compensation, which I think is coming in line to maybe with what they deserve. But the average carrier is now getting $50,000 to $60,000 for carrying the baby. So without even talking about lawyers' costs, agency costs, expense costs, travel costs, you're looking at 60,000. So if somebody doesn't have like a family or a friend or a person close by and needs an agency, you're looking at a package of 150 to $200,000. So it's a lot of
Right.
money for most of America.
Right, which, when you just say the same-sex marriages, every time my heart just breaks for them because they know out the gate that's what they're looking at, which is awful. Whereas, a heterosexual couple, you may be like, "Okay, maybe we're gonna get lucky with IVF, maybe it's gonna work." Like, you don't know yet the extent of it, but at least you're not at that starting point, right? Knowing, like, no matter what, in order to grow our family, it's gonna be this amount, 6 figures. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's a lot of money, and even when you look at lesbian couples, right? They just need to buy sperm most of the time, so usually that's cheaper. The good
Right,
thing about it is that now there are a lot of grants, right? They have Men
right,
Having Babies, which is an organization that gives grants, and there's
right.
tons of other organizations.
Loan
And
programs
yeah,
and
and
all kinds of things,
employers
yeah.
are starting to kick in with benefits that pay towards surrogacy as well.
Yes. Okay, so speaking of that, I feel like a lot of people are shocked with donation of sperm, egg, surrogacy, etcetera, that a lawyer needs to be involved. And tell us kind of where that fits in and why, because again, most people who are not in this world don't recognize, oh yeah, actually that does make sense. We do need an attorney and the around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever you do something which I refer to it globally as third party reproduction, right? So meaning that a traditional family is a man and a woman within the kinds of marriage, right? Within a marriage that doesn't need any outside help, doesn't need a doctor, doesn't need, right? So that's what we think about hundreds of years ago. That is how you maybe, and there were not all these options, right? So when you
Mhm.
need a third party, meaning you need an egg outside of your family unit, you need a womb, you need sperm, you need to basically cut off the parental rights of the person who's either donating an egg or sperm or whose womb you are using, right? Because they're going to have at times some kind of presumptive parental rights. And you need to
Mhm.
make sure those are cut off. So if you're using an egg donor or a sperm donor, you need a lawyer to do an agreement between the egg donor or sperm donor to make sure you're complying with the law and their rights to parent the child are cut off. And the same thing with the surrogate. You need to cut off her right to parent that baby if she's carrying the baby for you. Now, that's a very abbreviated, and that could be a whole topic. Why do you need a lawyer, right? Because there are other considerations besides just the right to parent. There's, disease testing and screening and criminal background checks and payments going back and forth and all sorts of things. Like it's going to be more complicated if it's a gestational surrogate than if it's an egg or sperm in terms of the time that you need to be involved with that person, right? Because the baby needs to cook for 9 months. So we need her involved for a longer period of time. But there's a lot of things that go into those contracts. And if you're a same sex couple, you may need a post birth adoption or some kind of parentage order that we need to be involved with as well.
And a lot of people are going abroad these days to do their either egg or sperm and or surrogate. How does that work with international law with having because the laws in different countries, even in different states, are different. So how would that work for international couples?
So international couples that are coming to the United States, we're it's very regulated here. And if you get somebody whose sole practice concentrates on reproductive law, it's not that hard if the couple lives outside the US. So for instance, in my practice, I've had 30 or 40 foreign countries. People come from all over. They've come from Russia, they've come from Europe, they've come from Israel, they've even come from Iran. It's easier if they come over here to get them parental rights. If they go abroad, it's almost uniformly for cost savings, right? So
Mhm. Right,
having, let's say, a surrogate and egg donor in Mexico may be half of what it costs in the United States,
right.
but there's a lot more concerns. I
Yeah,
mean,
so does the contract that you write up, does it hold water, so to speak, if you're having somebody, let's say, in Mexico do
so
that?
if they use somebody in Mexico, we need a Mexican to do the contracts. The only thing that I would do is the parental order when they come back to the United States, or the adoption, depending which it is. But I always tell people to be very careful. For instance, in Mexico, it could take a month or 2 months to come back here when you have a baby, because you have to get something that's called a consular report of birth, which takes time and guaranteed with the political turmoil. And so you may need to take off work for 2 months, and that may impact your cost savings. If your baby is born early, there isn't an FDA. It's sometimes the if you can pay for it, usually it's much safer to do it in the United States.
And I think all of those things are really important to consider before you're making these decisions of even looking outside of the United States because it is really popular right now. Like, okay, I'm going to go do this in Europe or where, all those places that you just mentioned. But if you look at the bigger picture, you may be saving some in one end, but maybe more on the other end in time or stress because of whatever hoops you need to go through in order to get back to the US. So I think that's really important just to consider all the things before you think you're saving money just by
Absolutely. And the only place that you're saving money is usually an underdeveloped country. So, for instance, there was extensive news coverage when war broke out. I think maybe it's over a year now in the Ukraine, because that was a very popular destination for surrogacy, and babies died or they became severely ill because they were born in basements and in war torn circumstances. Before that, the same thing had happened in Nepal. Nepal had become a big hub for surrogacy, and then there was an earthquake, and babies got stuck in the earthquake. And then there was a case where babies got switched, and the wrong parents got the babies biologically. So it's not that most of Europe doesn't allow surrogacy. So it's not that you're going to a developed country to do this. It's usually an underdeveloped country with serious risks. That doesn't mean it doesn't work out for a lot of people, but I would only advise someone to do that when it's a last option if they reside in the US.
Okay. So, what other advice would you give to somebody who's starting to think this might be a direction we need to go down as far as either surrogacy or um, donation of any sort where they would need an attorney? From your perspective, what's advice to give someone?
Well, the first thing that I tell people to do is, believe it or not, before they go to the lawyer, is to go to their doctor. Because people will come in and say, I've been having sex for 6 months and I'm not getting pregnant, so I need a surrogate.
You saying this first?
Yeah, yeah, they'll come to me first and say, "So I need a surrogate. I saw that, you offer this. Can you help me?" And they'll be years old and they won't realize that, they may not have eggs at that point, and maybe they need an egg donor, or maybe their husband's sperm isn't good. Like, the lawyer isn't usually your first stop. Usually you need to go to your doctor and figure out, but believe it or not, with all these shows on the internet and even podcasts, people hear, oh, I'm not getting pregnant, I'm just going to go to attorney Brisman's office and talk about using a egg donor or a sperm donor or a surrogate. And so I tell them, and then second, I tell them to get names of other people who did what they're doing, right? So sometimes people will call me and they say they're going to go to XYZ egg bank to get an egg, right? And it's a gay couple. And at that egg bank, they sell eggs in lots of six. And I say, well, how many kids do you want to have? And do you each want to use your sperm in a surrogate? And if we buy this egg and she only has six eggs left and all her other egg lots have been sold to other people and she's not donating anymore, you have to look at the fact that your children are not going to be biological half siblings. So, right, some people want that. They want at least the same egg donor when you have two
Right.
males or the same sperm donor. So we have to see how much, it's very commercialized now, how much inventory of the sperm is left. Like, has he met his cap on how many he could donate? So you want to really get educated before you do this. And there are certain things, like people will come to me and say they want to, they met their sperm donor on the internet and they're going to do a home insemination. And I'm like, wait, under New Jersey and New York law, home insemination doesn't cut off his rights. And that's not a good idea.
And
So,
that would be a bit lot good information to know before you go down that road, right?
yeah. And sometimes you just think, right, if you buy sperm, right, and you do it at home, it's, unless you're a doctor, it's not always as successful, right? Because it just in the normal course of life, people only get pregnant instantly when they're 16 in the backseat of a car, right? That doesn't normally happen for most couples. So we don't want you to, you're getting a sperm donor, to be doing cycle after cycle, because that's a lot on people.
And you just brought up this whole thing of sperm donors of late that has been in the pop culture, so to speak, of donating more than they probably should be or that they have should be. So what do you think from that perspective needs to place not only with the sperm donors, but I feel like there's been other things happening. There is a company in California that recently had some issues come up with embryos, and I feel like there's more and more regulations that are going to be put in place, even though in the United States, we already have regulations in place. But we're noticing as this industry continues to grow, there's other things that come up. So, from your perspective, with let's again use the sperm donor as an example, how do you protect yourself from knowing this Joe Schmo hasn't already donated a million times before or whatever it is?
Well, when it comes to sperm donation, the problem is, so in every aspect of the law, when science is always going to be ahead of the law, right? Because science is always going to develop more quickly than the law. So the law has caught up, let's say, with surrogacy, but not so much with certain aspects of it. Same thing with sperm donation. And there are basically two main parts where for sperm donation it hasn't caught up. One is the number of families that one can donate, right? So there's no regulation in the United States. So there is nothing that stops a sperm donor from going from bank to bank, right? If there are 12 banks or 20 banks, and most banks have a 25 family limit, right? So it's possible somebody could donate to hundreds of families. There's also no limit if they become a private donor and start advertising their sperm on the internet. So there's a Netflix series about some guy who has 1,000 kids, donated all over the place, and then they sued him, and he's supposed to not be donating, but there's no way to prove that he isn't, right? So that's, and then the second problem that I don't think is going to be a problem anymore is that about 40 years ago, when people donated sperm, it was fresh sperm. It wasn't frozen. They would go around, maybe they would actually ask medical students to donate. They would go to the floor, ask the medical students to donate. They would donate, and then they would go back to work. So there was a proliferation of doctors who used their own sperm because there were no protocols for that to be stopped. And so now, with the advent of these, what I call at home DNA kits, people like send away to 23andMe, they have a party, and then all of a sudden they realize they have all these siblings. And so people realized that some of their doctors, and there's like 100 of these cases, donated their sperm. I really don't think that it was a different time, As much as that
Right.
was deceitful and we don't like it, I don't think that that is a problem. I do think you'll see legislation, but I don't think that is a big problem anymore.
Agree. And it's funny, I feel like those people, for whatever reason, have come out of the woodwork to me. And, I hear the same story so many times of my dad was a doctor in New York and donated sperm. And now I have all these brothers and sisters and whatnot. But I agree with you. I think more so if somebody is looking for sperm, it sounds like there is no way to really protect yourself to know my child wouldn't potentially have, multiple children. You just kind of have to, I don't know who you would trust actually.
Yeah, there is a new sperm, I would call them matchmaking services opening up, and they are basically companies, entrepreneurs who open up these companies who you get to meet your donor, and the donor agrees to donate to no more than 3 families or 5 families, and he gets paid a substantial fee for doing that. And people have been using these matchmaking services, and a lot of them feel like, okay, they're meeting this person face to face, he's agreeing to something in a contract, that maybe that's a little safer as opposed to he's signing a consent form at a bank, gets a
Right.
couple $100 and then moves on to the next bank.
Right. But also, I guess I'm just skeptical because he might sign this contract to say that, but or else what? Like there's no what's the he decides
Consequence,
to
yeah, would be only
multiple
money.
times.
You could sue him for money. That's it. You wouldn't get,
Okay.
right. We're not going to kill the baby, right?
Right.
So that's the only remedy. In a lot of cases, and people say, well, what's that? It's money. But in most cases, right, when you have, let's just even say wrongful death, personal injury, breach of contract of any sort, most of the time, you don't get back what you wanted. It's just that in this case, what you wanted is so much more precious, right?
Mhm.
Most
Right.
remedies are money when you sue.
Right. And so since you've been doing this since 1996, what has been the biggest change that you've seen? Because I feel like even the last 3 years, we've seen women's health and things come back into the courts and whatnot. What's the biggest change that you've seen around fertility and the
Commercialization, right? So it used to be there was a lot more doctors, lawyers, matchmakers, agencies that were more in the field just because that's what they wanted to do. They found it interesting. They had a personal experience. Right now, I think you have to be much more careful because the industry is a billions of dollars, right? So
right?
you have a great number of people who enter in this industry for the wrong reason, and the lack of regulation around certain aspects make it an area where it's much easier to take advantage of people,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
Which is so sad, but also good to have that reminder because I think that I mean, I remember even driving with my husband one time and we heard a radio advertisement that they guaranteed you a baby if you did IVF with them. And I'm like, how is that even possible for them to legally say that out loud? It's so heartbreaking to me that they give this false hope speak to them.
Yeah, there
I
have
don't
been,
know.
unfortunately, a number of companies who have absconded with the money that was paid for certain services. So you just want to make sure you're dealing with a reputable company, whatever it is. If it's a lawyer or a doctor, there's proven results, and that things are safe, right? So that's what I worry about abroad. You send $60,000 abroad. What if they don't deliver? What if they just close? How are you getting your money back? You're not going to go to Mexico and sue them. That's like a very hard thing to do. So in the United States, there are some protections, but there are bad apples also. So you just have to be
Right.
careful.
Again, I think that because there's more eyes on it lately, though, I think that it's gonna quickly start to change because there's more things that are coming up in the news about, again, embryos being destroyed or the sperm person or whatever. I
Yes,
think
absolutely. Absolutely. The law will continue to proliferate, but there will always be factors in every field. It's just this field
Mhm,
is more prone to people not thinking logically, right? When you want a
mhm,
baby so badly, you sometimes overlook those red flags that you see in the back of your head. And so I always tell people if you see a red flag, you need to ask about it. You need to make sure, you need to check with your professionals and don't let your emotions override rational decisions in this process.
Right. And I'm sure you being involved with all these associations and societies and ASRM and all the things, you hear what's happening in the industry and you're aware of everything that's gone. So other than the commercialization, do you see that there would be any big shift coming?
Well, there are definitely big shifts in the industry. So, for instance, you used to see twins and triplets everywhere you went, right? Everybody was
Mhm.
having twins. But now the technology is so good that people are not having multiple births because the doctors realize that when you put in so many embryos into a womb that wasn't equipped to handle that by nature, that the babies were born early, and a lot of times they were fine, but a lot of times they weren't. They
Right.
had cerebral palsy or other things. So now you're seeing that there is not as big a rise as what we call high order. You're not going to see two, three babies come out of the womb as much. They're doing single embryo transfers. Also, you're going to see that in general, I think when it just comes to pregnancy, as the education gets out there, you're going to see less children born with certain diseases because
Mhm.
now they can test for them very early on, even before the embryo is put into the womb. They can test for a lot of these diseases, which is a good thing, right? Because you don't want your child to suffer with a disease if they don't have to, right? Especially if you can prevent that before that embryo is placed into the womb.
It's amazing to me that they're able to eradicate these diseases that have been in families, forever, and now it's changing that, which I think is very cool. I say all the time that we live in a time that it is still amazing to me that we're able to do surrogacy and we're able to have donors and we're able to do IVF and all of this. It's really amazing. And we're so fortunate that we have the technology that we have now because 50 years ago, it may have just been the thought in somebody's mind of, "Oh, I wonder if this will work." And now look at, we're doing all kinds of things.
Yeah, and I do think that one of the things that are hard for people is also the proliferation of right. So sometimes that's a great thing, right, to have a lot of choices. But sometimes when you have too many choices, you get bogged down in the details. So I always tell people something that my doctor told me: keep your eyes on the prize, right? Because people
Mhm.
could get themselves all wrapped up in very little aspects of the process, and they never really get started because they're, let's say, looking for the donor and nobody is perfect, or the perfect egg donor, or
Right.
the surrogate who has every single thing that is on, like, what a perfect. And I always tell people, when you have a child, that child's not going to be perfect. Sometimes they're going to drive you crazy, and you have to just realize that, too many choices sometimes can be a bad thing. You have to not sweat the small stuff.
Absolutely. I see that so often when people are looking for a donor because they don't agree with their partner, or one thing's important to the other person, or they're looking at multiple agencies rather than just one agency that may have a smaller inventory, so to speak, to choose from. So you definitely need to recognize your personality and see what's best for you in order to make that decision. The other thing I would say is I think don't understand how quick the process can actually go once you do choose a donor or a surrogate. Do you see what time frame do you generally see for people that go through this process from the seeing the doctor to talking to you and then actually having their process start and being pregnant?
Well, it can be very quick. For they see me, they get a donor, and within 11 or 12 months, they have a baby. And then I sometimes have people who are in my office for years, right? And a lot of that depends on them, and a little of it is going to depend on luck, right? So if they need an egg donor and they get an egg donor, but then it turns out it was the husband's sperm, they can be years, because not everything is exact. But if people want this to go quicker, there are always ways for it to go quicker. The reproductive challenge that takes the longest is usually surrogacy, because the harder to find, right? And also the screening process, meaning the FDA screening process, the ultrasound, the criminal background is much more intense. But finding a donor, I have clients who can look for a donor for a year and not find one. And sometimes I wonder if they are having second thoughts about having the kid, and that's just their way of manifesting it.
I think you might be very right there. And also, I part of that process of, do we do a donor, do we not? I think people get caught up in the idea of it not being mainstream, and now it is becoming more mainstream, and you mentioned earlier, find somebody who's done what you wanna do, and I always say that to my clients as well, because that gives you an idea of what you're looking forward to in the future for better or worse, and they can help you be ready to say, okay, this is what's coming down the pipeline, get ready for this or that or whatnot. And that really does help people to get their head around, oh, okay, well, Elizabeth did this and it's possible, or we better watch out or be aware for this or that. And when you mention that, to find somebody who's done it, what benefit or do you see in that, in finding somebody else who's down the road?
Because I think that people share experiences and they can share their fears, and just gives them comfort in knowing what they're doing is not unusual, but it also gives them comfort into where they're going and the place and how they behaved. I also think when it comes to donors, I find that people tend to focus on what the donor looks like, right? And
Mhm.
because they want their kid to look like them. So especially the heterosexual women that are using an egg donor. And in that case, I think certainly if you're African American or you're Asian, maybe you want to pick a donor of the same race. I can see that. But as far as looking exactly the same, kids come out how kids come out, right? You see, and
I
even when
always tell people, make anything like me.
yeah, and so it's not necessarily that just because you get a donor that looks like you, that the child is going to look like the donor.
Right. Do you see more that people are now wanting to know the donors and keep that relationship with them after the baby is born?
I think that you find that more with the same sex male couples than the females. I haven't found that the females really want to know the egg donors. Sometimes they do want to know the sperm donor. If they're gay female couples and the gay male couples want to know the egg donor, and this is very stereotypical, the heterosexual couples usually don't. Now, that doesn't mean always, no, but there is more of a number of people who do want to know the donors, and as opposed to knowing the donors, there is a great number of people, whatever their sexual orientation, who want access to the donors if the child needs it, as opposed to
Right.
knowing the donor and having them involved in their life. Those two things are different, right? Like if the child has a psychological need versus the need for the parent to want to have the donor involved.
And legally, is that pretty easy in the contract to is usually do people agree on that?
Well,
How does that
usually,
work?
if a donor is applying through an agency, the donor will say, I'm willing to help if the child needs it, or willing to be known now. I always tell anybody, so I counsel donors as well. I always tell a donor, if you think you're going to be anonymous for life, don't do this, right?
Mhm.
Because anybody can take an at home DNA kit. And I don't care if you don't put your DNA on one of these websites, somebody you're related to most likely will.
Right.
And even if it's a distant cousin. So if someone really wants to track you down with these DNA websites, in most cases, they'll be able to. So if
Mhm.
you think that it's 100% anonymous and that's what you want, I wouldn't become a donor. You have to
Right.
be willing to take that risk that someday somebody might find you.
Also with surrogacy in families, do you see that people assume that it's gonna go easier with having their sister or sister-in-law be the surrogate, and do
Yes,
they
and that's the farthest thing usually from the truth, right? So if you had a sister and she volunteers to be your surrogate, but you fight about everything, right? That's not going to change. It's going to get worse, right? So if you have a meddling mother who pits you against each other, like the family dynamic that you have it's very hard to have a relative do this for you. Now, most of the time, the best cases when it comes to a surrogate is when the sister in law is doing it. So if you have two brothers and one of the brothers' wives offers to do it, because that means that everybody's on board. If you have sisters and they're married to a man, a lot of times the husband doesn't want the sister to do it. That's not always the
interesting.
case. These are just stereotypes. It's not always. And a lot of times too, you have sisters who do it but don't really want to do it. Their mom is forcing them, or It's the most important part of a sister relationship is not the lawyer, it's the psychological screening. Because in the psych screening, the psychologist will be able to say, hey, this woman doesn't want to do it. I'm not passing her.
And do you see that ever?
Yes, I see it a
Oh,
lot,
okay. Do you?
actually,
Okay.
more
Because I
than
always wonder if those psych evals are actually like, if they just pass everyone through.
oh no. If you have a good clinic, they will fail you if they think they should. Now, that
Okay.
doesn't mean that you can't get the doctor to overrule psych because psych isn't the law, but most of the time, an experienced social worker or psychologist who's been doing this for a long time will be able to flesh that out. Or at least they'll be asking the right questions. And it might be that one of them backs out at the time.
And you still need an attorney even if they're a family member.
Absolutely, especially in a surrogacy. In almost every state, you cannot go to the hospital and tell the hospital that the baby coming out of your womb belongs to someone else. You need a court order to transfer legal custody. That doesn't mean your sister couldn't hand you the baby in the parking lot, but on the birth certificate, it's going to be that came on. And if she's married, it's going to be on the birth certificate that her husband is the parent. That means health insurance, travel. You have to get that birth certificate changed legally. The only way to do that is through the court system.
Yeah. And thank you for mentioning that because I have heard people think that we're going to use a family member to avoid all of those things. I'm like, not everything gets avoided as far as fees. You still need to go through that process. And I think, like you mentioned, it can bring up issues down the road. And so you want to make sure there's not going to be across the Thanksgiving table in 10 years from now any sort of issues that are coming up because somebody's thinking that this baby belongs to me and whatever the situation may
I,
be. But
I once had a sister donate eggs to her sister, and they didn't talk for 5 years after because the sister who donated the eggs didn't really have proper psychology. And she said every time she saw the twins, she thought they were her kids and she wanted to take them home. So
mm,
she was not mad at her sister, but she wasn't properly prepared and she regretted it. She should not have been passed as an egg donor.
right. Just definitely things to think about when you're considering, again, other ways to try to save money by using someone in the family. There are some things to think about for sure. Well,
Absolutely.
thank you so much for talking through some of these things with us. And where can people find you and work with you and learn from all your experience?
Absolutely. We have a lot of resources on our website. They can just go to reproductivelawyer.com. It's pretty easy. They could call us. It's 201 but usually the easiest is to go over our website and they can just send in a contact request and somebody will get back to them.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This is such a needed conversation because I feel like it's often left out of the conversation when we're talking about all things fertility that it is such a big part of the puzzle when you're doing surrogacy and or donation of any kind. So thanks for your today, Melissa.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Friends with Fertility. We hope that you found the stories, insights, and tips as inspiring and informative as we did. Remember, you are not alone on this journey. Your friends with fertility are here for you. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to follow us on social media for updates and more fertility resources. Until next time, stay hopeful and keep believing in your journey, and know that we are sending you lots of love.